So what I want to talk about now is relighting. And I think this is a really good opportunity. This shot really lends itself. It kind of reminds me to talk about the relighting tools because there's this natural lens flare that we see kind of baked into the original photography that was done for this shot. And this lens flare is kind of inspiration for the next things that I want to show you. So the cool thing about talking about the relighting tools is that light is fundamental to everything you do in compositing. If you didn't have light, Daryl, you'd have just a black frame on the screen, if you think about it. And what I want to talk about is these tools that really give you total control over color, light, volume inside of the 3D compositing workspace called Action. And at this point, you know, it's just that look development that we were doing earlier in grading. That's amazing. It's great. You can do isolations in different parts of your image. You can balance shots. That's all well and good. But what relighting really is about, it's about bringing in 3D data and using it in post. It's reusing that data and really taking something that was sort of flat and kind of putting it into this 3D environment. So what we're going to do next is if we come down to this composite that I've got working right now, it's going to move down to a frame where we see the car on screen, is we'll talk about, kind of introduce you to some of these relighting tools. So let's look in the schematic. Here we've got a pretty big scene. This is a 3D track scene. We've cut out that car. We've put it inside of a totally different environment. And into this environment, I want to bring in from the relighting menu here. You see all these different tools associated with relighting inside Action, the 3D compositing workspace. I'm going to bring a light. And let's also start with a lens flare, because remember that baked-in lens flare from the original principal photography? I want to kind of recreate that, because remember, I've got just a flat 2D car. I want the light to go wrap around this car. So as soon as I bring that in, you'll notice there's different components. This is a procedural lens flare. So different components are applied to that lens flare. I have the iris. I have different types of like irises and streaks and glows and rings, things that would be the natural artifacts as part of that lens flare. And I'm going to move the light backward, and as I do that, you can see it turns on the lens flare. And notice here what happens with the individual components. They're actually starting to be stretched out based on the 3D positioning of that light. So that's pretty cool. Let's pan that over so you can see it a little bit better. We can also, of course, adjust the intensity of our lens flare, maybe bring that down a little bit, and you can see how that affects the different aberrations for our components. Maybe we want to move that up in the scene a little bit, maybe even take the intensity down slightly more, and maybe move it over a little bit like that. Now, the other component of the lens flare that's interesting to talk about is the pivot point. So again, the pivot point can be actually moved in 3D space. You see, I'm actually moving that physically closer to the camera. I can actually pick up the widget on screen and move it around as well. So it's very interactive here. And I'm going to move it up here to show you that for the components, things like the iris, we could change that to be just the basic polygons. We can make that discs, which is what we see here in the original photography. So that's more appropriate for this. So you can really have total control over all of the different components of this lens flare as well. So we're going to position that in our 3D space to kind of cover up the headlight in the original photography. We can go to something like the streaks. If we go to the streaks, it has its own menus, its own pattern. We could do something like change the spread of the streaks. We could change the number of the streaks, right? So again, full control over how you want to customize these lens flares. They're not just stamping 2D lens flares on top of your image and using math to subtract one layer from another to get it to look like it's going behind things. There's actual natural occlusions that occur when we move our lens flare around in 3D space. So check this out. If I go behind the car now, it fades out because it's being blocked like it would be in the real world. And you can see my lens flare toward the camera. It's actually going to pop out when we get to the other side, right? So we see that naturalistic lens flare effect here right in front of my camera. So this is pretty cool. This is what it's all about. There's even things that you can do like on the occlusion side, we could even add points to a profile for the occlusions, and we could get this to customize things like a flash effect. So as I move my light now, notice what's going to happen as it gets closer to the car. It's going to dip down, and then it's going to flash back up because of that profile that I've created. So again, full control over all parameters of this lens flare. But this is a 2D car. I know that this car exists in 3D. In fact, at PSYOP, they had the 3D model of the car. So how does it work when you have 3D models? This gives you even more control. This is what I meant by bringing that 3D data into post. So what I'm going to do is come over and just pull out a couple of nodes that'll give us an idea of the benefits of taking this kind of control even further when you have 3D elements and that 3D data that you can grab onto. So what we're looking at here, let's move down to a little bit further in the timeline and look at this result, is this is a 3D model known as an FBX file. So a film box file. It's a standard that we created at Autodesk, and all 3D applications can write to it. It's a way of exchanging different 3D data between applications. And what we're doing here is we're actually bringing that car in to that same 3D environment we were looking at before with our 2D car. And if I come in and I turn on like a wireframe view, you can see I can actually select different parts of the car, right? So I can take just the windows, just the wheels, something like that. I've intentionally left this gap here on the headlight to kind of show you how we can use a combination of the 3D elements with the original live action photography, right? So this is where it gets really cool. I'm going to split the views and talk about another great tool which is called texture wraps. So the ability to take a texture and project it onto the surface of this car. So this is a 2D image I'm projecting onto the surface of the car. If we look at the options for that, you can see there's a pop-up. So it's the mapping is a projective type, and I can decide which camera I want to project from in my scene. And if I take this axis and sort of slide this over, you can see what's interesting about this, I think, is the fact that even though this looks like a texture that was generated in 3D, it isn't. This is actually the original photography. We're just projecting the original photography, which is kind of a cool option. We're going to project that back on and wrap that onto our scene. If we see there's little artifacts, some aliased edges there, we can turn on our hardware anti-aliasing. You can see that smooths that right out. And if I start to move the camera around, you can see that this 3D car is going to be able to receive that wrapped texture and give me that illusion that the original car is now in 3D space. So what's important about that? Why are we doing that, right? Well, it gets a little bit, if we take this a little bit further, if I bring in that same scene with the OpenEXR render pass, so again, this is in scene referred linear color space, so I'm going to switch my viewer temporarily to look at that and change the exposure of this reflection pass that was rendered out OpenEXR, so it's high dynamic range, so I can get access to all that data that's sitting inside that file to make those adjustments to the reflections and wrap that around that live action car. Let's switch back into the video color space because this is that same frame with that car. We're going to do a blend of those two elements together with a color correction, and I'm going to go back in to action and show you that we can then add our own lights inside action and make these adjustments to relight that scene with a combination of OpenEXR as well as the original plates. And once I've done that, you see I've just got some colored lights here to kind of exaggerate that. You can see just how good this looks. I mean, it's kind of amazing to take what was shot practical and now go in and make these types of adjustments. Let's go to this light as well. You can see as I make adjustments, you can see we're relighting the surface of that high dynamic range image, and it just looks amazing. Again, if we split the views, looking here, we've got our diffuse wrap, right? So this is the combination of those two elements put together, right? If I move that around, you can see we've got that. And then for the headlights, we're actually using the original image in the background. So again, it's the possibility of blending these two different types of techniques that give you this kind of result. And finally, if I go back and set the context for that shot and go back to my new blend and comp node, I can actually change the different types of ways that we're actually using the different transfer modes. So right now we're using screen, but I could use lighten. You can see that gives me slightly a different look. We'll go back to screen now. So you can really take advantage of a combination of techniques to come up with something that just looks great. So back to my timeline now. I'm going to go into this shot that really explains that a bit better. So we've got this scene where we've put a lens flare inside. We're going to put a lens flare inside of this ball. And this is just a 3D ball that we've painted on. You can see that if I start to move this paint stroke around, it's wrapped around the surface of that ball. And if we look in the media layers, this is the paint stroke, just quickly painted up with the paint program inside of Batch. And what we want to do is attach to this light, which is sitting in the center of that ball, we're going to attach a lens flare, because we wanted to also talk about the possibility of working with the lights inside of our sort of occluded by 3D objects. So what I can also do is go in and maybe, let's make this look a little bit nicer. We'll soften up the edges here of our ball, make that look a little bit more soft. And then as we start to scrub through the timeline now, you're going to see that these natural occlusions are going to occur when parts of that painted stroke cover up our lens flare. But you can see it's a very subtle thing, but you'll see they kind of very gently move into our lens flare as we sort of cross over the more transparent parts of that ball. So what we can do now is combine this 3D model, which is an FBX file, with our OpenEXR renders, much like what we were seeing before in the PSYOP example. So I'm going to go to the gateway, and I'm going to grab some OpenEXR renders that Maya rendered out. And inside of this multi-channel OpenEXR file, you're going to see there are multiple passes that we can take advantage of. And in terms of relighting, I think this is the most interesting one. This is the normal map. So what this normal map represents is the original light position inside of the 3D program. So in this case, I'm just going to load up my OpenEXR renders. And we're going to just take a little tour through what we see inside of here. So this is beauty pass. We have the Z-depth pass. We have also the normal map, as I mentioned before. And we're going to utilize these in action. And we'll drop from our original scene, we'll drop in a new action. And we're just going to add a couple of layers. So this is going to allow us to add on top of our scene so far. So we're just looking at the ball with the lens flare. We're going to bring in, wrong one. Going to bring in the beauty and this matte, and we'll also bring in the normal map. And at first it looks a little strange because the normal map's been introduced as an image layer, so we'll throw that away. So now we just have our OpenEXR that we're going to combine with that 3D model underneath. So what's important here is the fact that in the relighting tools, I'm going to bring a couple more lights, is that we can work in float. So this is great. We can work with floating point images. I can take my lights, I can position them around, and you can see as I adjust the intensity of these lights, I'm actually changing the exposure of those files. So I can really go in and very subtly dial in exactly the amount of exposure that I want to apply to this OpenEXR render file. I can also go in and make changes to the color. So maybe I want to make this one a little more purple. And again, just by going to the intensity and bringing up the intensity, I'm basically changing that exposure. But we're not really taking advantage of the metadata that came across in that OpenEXR file because we're not using the normal map. So let's go back to the bin, and under the map section, there's the option for normal map. And as soon as I bring that in, you can see that the look completely changes. And that's because if we move these lights back and start to bring up the intensity, as I move this light backwards and forwards, you can see that the surface is changing. This is a flat rendered image, but it's appearing like it's a rounded surface because we're working with that normal map. All of the lighting information is baked into that particular extra metadata file. And if I move this light back, same thing. You can see it's going to have that curved kind of feeling as it passes around the ball. The next thing I'll do is just come back to my layer, and we'll use a Photoshop compatible blending mode. Let's use linear dodge, and now we can sort of use a combination of our lighting and our transfer modes to really go in and relight this scene. And that's really what it's all about. And that's the point of this demonstration, is the ability to have control over the light in your scene in 3D space. So with that, I'd like to introduce Maya, bring Maya into the equation, and have Daryl sort of walk you through how he created the particles inside of that sphere for the earlier example, and then I'll restart into the timeline workflow and show you some of the powerful features in there.
Sure. So obviously inside of Maya we have several choices when it comes to doing dynamics, and in this example we're going to be looking at end particles, and we're going to use them to fill the volume of the sphere with a few more particles. So if we bring up the options for the create, what we're going to do is go ahead and just apply this, and it's going to fill that volume again in with a particle system. If we play this back, those end particles automatically have a gravity associated to them. What we want to do is we want to constrain their position to the inside of this sphere, and we're going to be using a force to do this. So essentially we're going to be using wind to keep these particles inside of that ball. So we'll go ahead and, while the particles are still highlighted, we'll create a new volume force. I'll just slide this over here, and you'll see that that's basically a cube. For this example, obviously we want it to be inside of a sphere. So what I'll do is I'll just adjust a preset to one that kind of fits it to this shape properly. And if we begin playing this back one more time, you'll see that those particles basically drop down and they kind of stack up on top of themselves. And this is one of the advantages that nParticles gives us, is the ability for these particles to collide with themselves. So it gives us this almost fluid look. Now obviously if I start playing around with the size of the sphere or moving the sphere around, I'm going to be changing the constraint that those particles are inside of. We can sit here and interactively adjust this to really get the look and feel that we want. So as I start to increase the magnitude, you can see those guys move around a little bit more. And that's basically all I did. Was I just kind of made some particles, played around with some attributes, came up with something that I thought looked cool. Then I rendered that all out as an OpenEXR multi-channel file, including motion vector information that Bill can take into the post environment, into flame, flare, smoke, and use that.
Great, Daryl. Thank you very much. So what we saw was the ability in Flame Premium and with Maya to actually work with the metadata transfer of different types of source imagery. So we've got our OpenEXR render files that, again, we were able to relight using the normal map. And of course, we also saw the ability to bring in the FBX files, these 3D models, and then apply texture projections on top of them, and also, of course, all those interesting relighting tools. So now I'd like to just take you through the last part of the demonstration, which really appeals to those smoke editors out there that always wanted all the cool flame tools, but again, they didn't have them before. But in this version, in the Flame Premium version of the Timeline UI, you can actually go in and use all the tools available inside of Flame. So I thought this shot would be a good one to kind of talk about in terms of relighting. We got the guy kind of bending down to get the dove, and it sort of lent itself well, I think, to our relighting story. So I'm going to jump into a pre-batch effect to do kind of a backlight effect. And to do that, I'll drop in action again. We saw this before. I'm just going to grab the same layer, and I'm going to bring that in. So what I'm going to do now is just create a quick key. We'll jump into the luminance key here and show you that I can quickly just make a rough matte. I'm just going to just clamp the colors here in the histogram and invert that to make a quick matte. And the point of doing that is that when I start to bring in my lights, I can start to relight and have the guy kind of isolated in front of that background. So we'll bring in a couple lights. We're going to send one of those lights way back, and this light are in front to kind of be our general light, and this one I'm going to send way back and kind of move it up here. And if we go in and actually attach from the relighting menu something called a raise object, so we've seen the lens flare, the raise object is another option in the relighting tools, which kind of creates this sort of God rays, right? So you can see I can go in, and as I adjust the intensity of that light and we start to move through, you're going to see the light is going to go around the guy because of that matte. We could also go in and change the color. I could pick a color on screen, or I could even pick a color from my menu here. You can see I can start to move that around, and we're going to get this real sort of lens effect, right? This lens kind of rays effect going around my character. So it's a very photorealistic example, I think, of what you can do with these different relighting tools. Let's temporarily hide that, and to the same light, we're going to attach the lens flare again. So we'll bring the lens flare out again, but this time we can customize it. I didn't really show this before, but you can customize things like the color. So let's make this sit better in this scene. We'll apply some of the colors that we had from before. We can do that to the different components, maybe make the streak also have the same color. And again, on the light, we can move the pivot point forward. Let's move that pivot point forward so we can really see the effect. We can change the intensity of the lens flare. And now when we unhide the raise object, we're really combining all of these different things into a very powerful photorealistic lighting effect. You can see as it goes behind the building, we can get our lens flare to kind of flash on when it goes through this gap. So again, very, very powerful tools for relighting. When I exit back out of the timeline, back to the timeline now from that effect, I have other shots in my timeline, if you remember, that the guy kind of interacting with the bird. So we had him kind of picking up the bird to take him home here. He had this guy, like right after he came out of, bent down and picked it up the first time, then he goes into the dream sequence. So we cut to that same shot 3 different times. Well, I only have applied that lens flare to one of those shots, right? It's sitting here as a little icon on top of the shot in the middle. Well, what's great about the timeline workflow is I can very easily and gesturally pick up that effect. Everything inside of that batch effect can be applied now to other shots in my timeline. So this is great. This, again, is part of the efficiency of being able to work with the same tools inside of this environment. So now we very quickly were able to make those adjustments. I could step inside and go in and make tweaks to that to kind of make it more specific. But in the interest of time, I'm going to move down to the next example. So here's one that I think is also really cool. This was where the bird flew into the brick wall, right? In the next scene, he actually hits the wall here. And we've got the green screen of that. And I'm going to select that now and jump into a pre-batch effect where I have just a starting point for our scene here, which is the layers fed in and then just a white frame brought into to the scene. And what's great about working inside of this 3D compositing area is you have the possibility of applying things like procedural textures to surfaces, right? So this is just a white card, but if I go into the substance texture generator, I have an entire library of photorealistic, based on categories, procedural textures. And I'm going to load up a brick wall because we didn't have that image for a brick wall. I'm just going to load that up very quickly. And let's put in a tiled wall and zoom in. So this is really neat. You can actually go into the various parameters now and make adjustments. So I could go in and change things like the luminance value, the saturation. I can make my own brick walls. I can go to the materials. I could have more mortar between the bricks or none. Right, so you can really customize this. You can change the age of the bricks. You know, all these things. You can have a higher number of bricks. You can have tinier bricks if you want. And if I rotate this card around now, the really interesting illusion here is it really looks like it's 3D until you take it to its side, and you can see that this is actually just that flat card that we started with. So again, we're using the same techniques that they use in game engines to make things look 3D, even though they're not. And we'll bring in the bird now because the other part of the lighting story that I wanted to tell was around shadows. So it would make sense as the bird's flying in here, there should be a shadow on the bird, right? So if we bring in the shadow now, you can see we can have a realistic shadow applied there. And if I wanted to, I could also adjust the position of the bird relative to the shadow, relative to the wall, excuse me, to say, let's have the bird's shadow be kind of bigger as he's flying in because he's further away. We can do that very easily by just sort of moving him forward this way. And now we've got our more blurry bird. And then as he flies in, he's going to come closer to the wall. I want that shadow to kind of come into focus, right? So I can move that in. So again, I have the ability to kind of manipulate that shadow multiple ways. In the schematic view, I can even change things like the softness, right? And then that can be animated as well. So we could create that effect as he's coming closer to the wall. So that's pretty good. The other thing I want to do is bring in the poster, right? So I've got the poster. There's different options for doing that. I could bring in the poster by using a projector. Again, this is a very powerful tool inside of Flame that allows you to project, almost like casting light from a projector. That the icon looks a bit like a film projector or a slide projector. And if I pull that back, and then say, let's use a transfer mode like screen and adjust the transparency, we can make that look like an old-time, washed-out, painted poster on the wall. Or we could even go back to a regular image, just a standard image here, and let's take the image and use a technique that I think is also very interesting for Flame users, which is the ability to repurpose some of these textures that we're actually using inside of our substance texture generator. So if I apply the normal map and the parallax map to that image, you can see that right away we get that same kind of 3D feel on top of our poster there. So that's kind of cool. And if we use, again, a different blending mode, we can get something that's going to allow us to integrate that poster and make it look like it's bumping like the brick wall, and we've got a very cool result. The last thing I want to talk about is the fact that in the timeline UI of Flame Premium, you have access to the entire batch module. And that's very important, again, for those smoke editors out there that want to do 3D tracking and want to be able to use all of the batch nodes to do shot-based work. If we come in here, I'm just going to bring in this last shot, which is a helicopter shot. This is when they flew into the dream sequence, right? And we have this paradise scene here. What I want to do is analyze this helicopter flyover movement, recreate the camera, and then place an object in that scene. And I think it's a great way to end this demonstration because it's a very impressive technology, the 3D tracking technology inside of Flame Premium. So we'll come in here, and I'm just going to throw away the image that we started with, and I'm going to add in what's called an analyzer node. And an analyzer can actually work in either mono or stereo. So for stereoscopic scenes, you can analyze and 3D track for the left and the right eye, which is very cool. It's an automatic process, which when I kick off, it's in the background. It'll just do it, again, automatically for me, and it'll return a solve for that newly generated camera. So we've done that. Let's look through that camera now. And you can see that we've got tracker marks all over this scene, right? This is going to help me really kind of define where I want to place my objects in that scene. We're going to start by doing a bit of fine tuning. I'm going to say, let's define the ground plane. Because it was a helicopter shot, it was kind of difficult to calculate that. So I'm just going to select a few points on the ground, what I know should be the ground. We can rotate those around. We could also maybe scale this down a bit, make that a little bit more in alignment with our river here. So you can see now we've created what should be the ground in our scene. I'll turn off define. Let's also go in and just turn off the grid because it's a bit distracting. And let's go back to the analyzer now and start to pick some points. And these points are going to be relevant for where, again, I place my objects in my scene. So I'm just going to select a few points, and I'm going to do what's called create a point cloud. And that creation of the point cloud actually allows me to then go in and say, this is the area, that little cluster of points where I want to lock on to with my 3D element. So in this case, I can change the display to something that's a little bit, makes more sense to be on the ground there. And I'll go back to the analyzer, and I also want to pick up a point on one of these trees, and I'm going to create an axis. And the reason for doing that is I want to have a specific location in my 3D scene if I want to place different objects. And in this case, I want to reintroduce the trees in front of the 3D object that I drop in. So I want to have a location for that in my point cloud inside of my 3D scene so that I can easily find that location in 3D space. At this point, I don't need the analyzer anymore. We can look through the camera. You can see we have our working camera here where we're actually viewing through to our scene. And what I want to do is go in and look through the appropriate camera for this. So let's just switch to the correct camera. We can also hide the original camera. If I can select it, let's hide that. And now what we see is our grid right there on the ground. We've got our reference point cloud. Let's go grab we'll import the 3D model that I want to bring in. It's an FBX file as well. So we'll just bring in that FBX file. I'm going to drop a Coliseum into this scene. And when I just attach that to the point cloud now, let's also add a light. The light will help me make the shading work on the Coliseum. We'll move that light back. And let's go in now and scale this down a little bit. So I just want to kind of find a place in my scene to lock it to. So I'll start by scaling it. And then holding a hotkey, I'm just going to say snap to the axes that I want to attach it to. So maybe I'll go to the one here. That's going to work a little bit better. Maybe scale that down slightly more. We could also go to the materials. We could change the color of the Coliseum. We could also turn on our hardware anti-aliasing to clean up those aliased edges. But the point here is now we're starting to place that Coliseum inside of that scene. If we look through the working camera again, let's look through the working camera one more time. What we'll see is that the Coliseum isn't exactly resting directly on the ground, so this is a way of helping to avoid having that slide around on the ground. We're going to just lift it up a little bit so it's really sitting on the ground. And now again, when I move through the scene, we'll see that it looks like it's actually part of that scene. And again, it's not moving, it's the camera that we created moving by that 3D model in 3D space. But as I mentioned before, the last little thing I want to do is that the trees are actually being covered up because we were putting the 3D model on top of the background. We want to reintroduce part of the background back on top. And that's why I created this locator inside of my scene for the trees, right? So that's going to allow me to really go in and place something back in front. So to do that, we're going to just take our original background layer, we're going to copy it, we'll attach it to the camera, and we'll go in and sort of clear out all of the parameters that were there before. And again, in the working camera view, what we're going to do is grab a hold of that axis. I'm also going to attach a shader to it because it's going to be affected by the lighting, so I don't want that. So you can use shaders actually to turn off light, so it's a good trick. Let's do that. And when we come down here now, I just want to say, let's orbit the camera around in the working camera view. Let's now move this layer and put it in front of the other layer. I'm going to also do that using this option for on all transforms. It's going to automatically scale that down as it gets closer to the camera. And as I move that closer to the camera, essentially what we've done is we've created almost like a sandwich plate. We have our back plate, we have our model sitting between the back plate, and now we've reintroduced that back plate in front. So you can see it's sort of sneaking out from underneath there. But what I really want to do is introduce that, just a portion of that plate, just this tree area, back on top. And to do that, we're going to attach that garbage mask that we looked at earlier. So that garbage mask that sits inside the 3D compositing workspace in Action, I'm going to introduce a garbage mask and just kind of draw a garbage mask around that tree. And when I do that, and I switch that to be inverted, and let's also apply that just to that layer, you can see that now we're sandwiching that Coliseum between the back plate and the foreground that we're masking back in front of that 3D tracked camera. So that's pretty cool. And I can also go in and, of course, I can adjust the edges of this, maybe expand that out, sort of soften that out, so you have, again, control over the masking tools as well. And now we see we've got that effect where we've placed something in the scene and reintroduced a portion of it back on top. So I think it's a great example of what you can do. And again, in the working camera view, if we kind of bring our camera around like this, you can see exactly what's going on. You can see that portion of the area that we're trying to reintroduce inside of that garbage mask, and we have our camera flying through and around the Coliseum. So pretty neat stuff. Last thing I want to show you is a more fully realized version of that scene. This is actually introducing also some 3D particles into the scene. So this is another feature inside of Action, the ability to generate 3D particles that can be used for different types of effects. So in this case, we're creating a cloud effect because our dream sequence, we want to fly in, have the camera fly through the clouds into our dream sequence. So you can also put the 3D particles in front of that camera, and they'll actually allow you to fly through them. So it's all really cool stuff. Anyway, and that was all done in the timeline UI. So for those of you that want to work that way with the timeline, but with all the Flame tools, it's possible to do that. So I'm just going to quickly wrap up. I'm running over my time. You've been watching a demonstration of Flame Premium. It's what we like to call total control and finishing. We've looked at grading, real-time color grading. So you Flame users who want to use the real-time grading tools, you need to get Flame Premium for that. We've also looked at the visual effects portion of the software where we did all that cool relighting and 3D tracking. So all you colorists who want to take your look development further by doing relighting, you can do that. And then finally, the timeline UI where you have that great timeline workflow with all the great Flame tools.